to our 2025 economic outlook. Thank you for joining us. I'm Tanvi Sinha, Audit Manager at Matthew Scudder and Boyce CPAs in Fairfax, Virginia. At MCB, we are proud to have served businesses and individuals in the DMV area for more than 75 years. For the past 11 years, MCB has been hosting a complimentary economic outlook for our clients, colleagues, and friends. We are honored to welcome renowned economist Dr. Terry Clower, Director, Center for Regional Analysis, George Mason University. Dr. Clower's annual economic outlook is always a highlight of the new year. As many of you know, it's always an incredibly entertaining and informative 90 minutes, and it always feels too short. Before I turn it over to Dr. Clower, a few items to share. The presentation will run for an hour and a half, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A, which will be facilitated by my colleague, Dean Peterson, Tax Director at MCB. If you have questions, please submit your questions via the chat feature. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. In the coming weeks, we will send an email to all registrants with a link to the summary recording of Dr. Clower's presentation. Dr. Clower is the Northern Virginia Chair and Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University. He's also the Director of GMU's Center for Regional Analysis. The center provides economic and public policy research services to local governments and businesses, primarily located in the Washington, D.C. metro area. Today, Dr. Clower will provide us with insights into economic trends in Fairfax County, the greater Washington, D.C. area, and across the country. Now, it is my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Dr. Terry Clower.
So thank you, Tanvi. And let's see, I think we got a slide will be coming up here in just a moment. So we will get started here. It has been and is likely to be a very interesting year in the regional economy. As we're moving forward and waiting for the slides to come up, I've actually have been a little cheeky in my title of the presentation this year and talked about it being a year of known unknowns. And what I mean by that is that there is a lot that's going on in the national economy, international trade, and the regional economy that are going to be things that could dramatically affect our regional economy, but are not necessarily within our control. There are things that are what we would call in research exogenous to us. In other words, coming from outside forces. And in this case, it's going to be some of the proposals and policies that are proposed by the incoming Trump administration. The issues that we will be dealing with throughout this, I think, need to be taken in context of what's happening in the national economy. Some of the changes that are being recommended will impact the national economy, and then we will move forward into what actually gets passed through legislation and what the Trump administration can do through executive order. So moving right into it, as we look at U.S. gross domestic product, you can kind of, if you will, what I want you to do is just imagine a line going up through what that trend line would have looked like if the pandemic had not happened. And what you can imagine out of this is that we're pretty close, but not quite back to what we had for trend line. So we are seeing growth. We are seeing expectations of growth to be about 2.6%, 2.7%, something like that. I think for the year, it's going to wind up being a decent year, not a spectacular year by growth, but it's going to be, indications pretty solid. However, our trends have been showing that we are somewhat slowing in our growth. Payroll jobs continue to just kind of in some respects, knock it out of the park. We had a couple of months that, we didn't look real good in one month in October, and that had everybody worried. But there were a lot of factors that were going into that month that were doing it. We had the strike by longshoremen. You had other disruptions in the market. You certainly had the impacts of the hurricane that were impacting much of the Southeast. So there was just some odd things coming out here. The December job numbers of plus 256,000 surprised folks to the upside a good bit. And so this continues to be an economy that is expanding in the labor market overall. There has been, versus last year when we got together, a little bit of a drop down in the number of open positions. But by and large, it's still one that businesses are hiring, businesses are expanding. And we'll talk about some details of that in just a moment. The unemployment rate has actually ticked up a little bit, which is a little bit of change from what we saw. We're still seeing that this difference that you see here, for those of you who have been to these presentations before, and many of you have done it for several years now, that UR rate that I see there, the dark green in the upper chart, that's the headline unemployment rate. We call it the U3 rate. The U6 rate is the rate when you count folks who have part-time jobs but would rather be working full-time, so they're underemployed in that sense. That gap between the U6 rate and the U3 rate is stayed very stable throughout this year. And we use that as an early indicator. When we start seeing employment, particularly in hourly employment, starting to drop from full-time down to part-time work, that's an early indication of really weakening labor markets. And at this point, it's a little softer than it was a year ago when we talked, but it's still quite positive, and it's ticked up just a little bit. Down below, the labor force participation rate has been relatively stable, and in fact, it's one that you'll note that we have not recovered back to pre-pandemic levels. Keep in mind, look at the y-axis. So these are fairly small percentage changes, but in terms of the overall labor market, over 100 million labor market, this means a lot of people. And what has concerned us more recently is, with some bouncing around, we basically, the last year or so, almost 2 years, our labor force participation rate has flattened out. Now, to put this in long-term context, if we go back to the Great Recession, so, back in the mid-2000s, prior to the Great Recession, our labor force participation rate in this country was running in that 65 to 66%. And we had folks that lost their jobs in the Great Recession that just never really entered the full-time or even the regular formal labor markets, never really got back into it. Many of them retired early. You probably all know folks that did that. And what we have seen now is that we've reached back to a little bit of a plateau. So that means two things. One is we need to question about then labor availability. We certainly, the baby boomers are aging out, more are retiring. We have the Gen Z's and the Gen Next coming up, and that's where we're seeing a little bit in higher education, a bit of just a few year kind of mini baby bust going on that's impacting some of what's happening with enrollments at some places, although generally I think enrollments are still doing pretty well. But nonetheless, I think our key concern here is getting, have we reached a post-pandemic new equilibrium in labor force participation rate that's a little bit lower than it was before? You can remember that we had all these challenges about particularly young parents, and let's face it, young mothers were taking much of the brunt of this, where they were dropping out of the workforce because there wasn't an availability of childcare. Or, and of course, and what we all know about the cost of childcare that we'll talk about more. So these are just at national levels, but point to some real challenges as we're moving forward. It also, I would tell you, as a precursor of further conversation we'll have later in this session, about the importance of having labor availability of which immigrants, international immigrants, are a part of that story. Average weekly earnings continue to rise. Look at the difference in the slope of the line before the pandemic. And the pandemic, you can characterize, you see that little bump in the middle of the upper line up there? That little bump is an artifact of who lost their jobs during the pandemic. It was mostly service industry workers, retail, restaurants, hotels, those kind of things. And on average, those folks have lower wage levels. Now, the average weekly earnings, the reason I look at that is that takes into account how many hours are being worked, as well as then the average wages. This is the measure that if we were starting to see notable weakness in the economy, in particularly in the labor markets, it would show up here first, because one of the first things that happens when companies start cutting back, instead of just laying off people, and this is broad terms, it doesn't apply to every industry just this way, but instead of laying off folks, they will cut back hours. And so this changes the average weekly earnings before it changes the average hourly earnings. But what you see is that prior to the pandemic, we were going along, and then after the pandemic, that slope of that line changes and ticks upwards. We have been making actual progress in real wages, real weekly earnings, average weekly earnings has been rising. And we've been hearing these stories about this. This has been something from whether it's the new deal that the longshoremen just signed, I believe they haven't signed it yet, but agreed to this week. Auto workers, other represented groups, we've seen that across several industries where there have been notable increases in wages. Though what I want you to keep in mind for something that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, if you're rising wages like this, you've changed the slope of that line, what happens with prices? They're going to have to increase to cover those higher labor costs. So let's talk about consumer confidence in just a moment here. And you can see we had that huge, the two situations. So the present situation is, how do you feel about things are going now? The expectation looks out about 6 months from now. And, we've actually, during the course of this last campaign, if you looked over there to the right side of the blue line, we actually saw it kind of dip down some. And some of that had to do with political rhetoric. The economy's horrible, it's doing this, it's doing that. And, and obviously from the outcome of the election, a lot of folks believed it. We saw a little bit of a bump there. If I go to the expectations of how do you think are going on, we didn't see quite the swings that we did, of course, in the present situation from the pandemic, but we did see that things kind of went down into a new level. And here more recently, during 2024, they've started to tick up again. Those two circles with the arrows that I have under there, that one back in 2016 was what we came to call the Trump bump. When President Trump in his first term was elected, expectations rose dramatically from November to December of that year. It was really interesting. This year, there has been another little uptick, but in order of magnitude, not nearly as big as we saw last time. Don't have any idea what that means in the long run. I just thought it was interesting that we did see a little bit of an uptick again, but it wasn't as big as the first Trump administration. So let's now talk about consumer prices for just a little bit. And one of the things is data were just released this week after I had submitted this to the folks at MCB to post up for this presentation. So we'll update this, but you'll notice that obviously we had that big spike. The Federal Reserve says their target rate is 2 to 2.5%. And they kind of give themselves the wiggle room in that. One of our key things is that in November, it was 2.7. Our actual December number, that headline number of year over year or month over year, I should phrase it as, is actually ticked up to 2.9%. We're actually seeing some additional pressures in prices. And all along, you will remember that last year and even the year before, we talked about that tie-in with interest rates and prices. And we're talking about, and I think, it came to one that all of us together in our questions and answers in the presentation, came to kind of the conclusion that getting from that levels of around 3% or something like that down to 2.5% to 2%, that last mile, if you would, of the journey was going to be pretty tough and going to be hard for the Fed to achieve. And so our forecast then said that interest rates would stay higher for longer. So we see this slight uptick in December. We still have some of the new wage increases that were negotiated by various unions and others that have taken. And one of the things we see is that when union represented workers get wage increases, you usually wind up having other wages follow them. It's not nearly as big as, say, it was in the 1970s. Our union participation rate is much lower in the country now, probably around 10%, something like that, maybe even below that. But we are seeing a lot of folks that we're seeing a lot of pressures that I think are going to keep it high. Now, we had talked about that or one of the things we had heard the Fed talk about was they had come down a little bit in interest rates, and they were going to, in 2025, do a series of reductions. As many as 4 were anticipated by the market. And right now, it's not clear if that's going to quite happen. If we focus this a little bit more into producer prices, where, this is the underlying, and producer prices had actually dropped down below the 2% level for parts of last year, and then we started to see that rise a little bit. That number for December that was just released yesterday is 3.3%. So it's just a little bit positive. Now, much of that, you'll notice in the month of November, gasoline prices had actually, as measured in the producer price index, had shown a 9.3% drop. For the December numbers, that's a positive 9.7% increase. So gasoline at the producer price level has gone up a good bit, and it's always pretty volatile that you get from that. Services at 3.9% rise, which reflects a lot of the labor rate and all of that. That is still at about 3.7%. So if you think that producer prices are a little bit of a leading indicator of what we would expect to happen in consumer prices, then we have to conclude that prices are going to be rising some still in the early part of 2025. And it may be really difficult for the Fed with their mandate to both promote the labor market, but the labor market appears to be still strong with the 265,000 jobs in December, that they're not going to increase, or rather they are going to pause their program of rate decreases. We will see what happens in the next few weeks, but that will be coming out. I do expect the Trump administration to place pressures on Chairman Powell or whoever happens to wind up being in that position. But for now, it is Chairman Powell. And I would expect there to be pressures exerted, but he seems to be pretty able to withstand those pressures. Home sales, we've got 2 stories going on here. The new home sales had a nice little uptick on a year-over-year basis in November. November is the latest data that we have available for that. Existing home sales are still down somewhat, and I think we can relate this to the 1 or 2 things. Folks may like their house, but they love that mortgage. If they bought a home anytime during the low interest rate, some people are sitting on 15-year notes that were in the 2.5 and even percent lower levels. Many of us have 30-year notes at below 3% level. And of course, and then that whole range of the 3 to 4%, it would be really hard pressed to want to go out now and be at that 6.7, 6.8. And there's actually been a little uptick in recent weeks. Now, the National Association of Realtors is expecting that number to come down substantially. Our own forecast that we do for the Northern Virginia Association of Realtors was based on an expectation that mortgage rates would float between the 6 to 6.5%. There are some factors that are coming into play now that I don't know if we're going to quite achieve that, and we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. The issue with new home sales, certainly we've had some uptick, but broadly speaking, just like we've had in this region, and we will talk about it more later, but just like we've had here, nationally, we simply are not building as many homes that are being demanded. So some of this is just, we continue to see a need for more homes to be built. And this is pretty much across the board. There are markets that are obviously softer, and rural markets are obviously not doing as well. But still, the broad lesson is we need to be building more homes. And of course, that especially applies to this area, and that existing home sales are still going to be somewhat depressed. Folks are getting more used to the 6% mortgage again. You're having people who are merging back up. They've kind of just acknowledged that, hey, it's probably not going to go back to sub 4%. But that still impedes some people from wanting to leave their existing home. I stuck this in here just as I find it fascinating. And we're looking at these numbers, and they're quarterly numbers that are released by the Census Bureau. But what is interesting is you see that big spike in e-commerce sales during the pandemic. And then, of course, it dropped back a little bit. But now we're seeing that trend line. We're just about back up to the pandemic era peak of what we saw then. We're just barely below it. And so the implications for brick and mortar retail, for the way we do transport and services and everything else, I think is really tied somewhat to this. We've gotten very used to doing our ordering on Amazon or from, the grocery apps or anything else. For those of you that happen to be living in Maryland or working in Maryland that have joined us today, of course, you know that part of the Governor Moore plan to help address the budget deficit there is to add a tax onto your delivery service fees for Amazon and everybody else as a way to generate some revenue for transportation infrastructure, which from an economic perspective makes sense. If you got more trucks on the road, heavier vans and vehicles doing deliveries all in your neighborhoods, well, you probably need to have more money coming in to eventually repair those streets and roads. So I want to change, and this is something that we've not done before, is to specifically address issues of international trade and tariffs and how that might impact the country. Now, I'm not going to try and go through every piece of this, and certainly the slides will be available for everybody. It will be posted on the MCB website here in a few days. What I wanted to highlight here is a couple of things. So interestingly enough, President Trump, who self-admittedly, and I don't even know if it proclaims of how much he loves tariffs. It's the best word in the dictionary, or the most wonderful word in the dictionary. And he imposed several tariffs during his previous administration, some to achieve negotiation tactics on other issues. What was interesting is that, if anything, President Biden not only kept those tariffs in place by and large, a couple expired, but by and large they kept in place, and in fact expanded them, particularly the ones in the 301 sector. But part of what I wanted to bring up here, if you think about it, if your business relies on imported goods, either as intermediate products that are then modified, or otherwise, it's raw materials that you use in your production process, or goods and services, or in particularly goods that you bring in, the sheer volatility of what we did. So in 2018, we had the steel and aluminum tariffs under Section 232. They excluded, had these tariff rates of 25% for steel, 10% for aluminum. In 2019, removed Canada and Mexico from those countries whose goods got taxed. In 2020, expanded it to add what's called derivative products, particularly for steel. In August of 2020, Canada was added back in. In September of 2020, Canada was removed. In 2022, President Biden replaced some of the tariffs with rate quotas, meaning that in a rate quota, you get a certain amount of goods coming in that are the tariffs don't apply to, and beyond that amount, then you pay a tariff on. The big one here is the Section 301 that was done predominantly to address intellectual property and technology transfer issues. It's a long list of products that are on there now. I tried to do a rough count through the notices in the Federal Register, and the best I could come up with, without making myself go blind, was something in order of, it's now over 800 different commodities that are listed. You had a list that came out. It says a 25% started out as a tariff. First list came out in March of 2018. Then another list was brought out. And then there was another list for 10% on additional items. And then that was raised to 15%. And then you had a 4A and 4B that was reduced somewhat. But now in May of 2024, President Biden retained the existing and then added new tariffs of 25% to even 100% on selected strategic items. So the 100%, for example, is on Chinese-made electric vehicles, protecting our markets. There have been lots of modifications to these. I don't think anybody would be surprised that there's a political overtone for that. The National Tax Journal, National Tax Foundation, I should say, and some of their publication noting that there is a clear correlation between the companies that received exclusions for their goods in the 301 tariff schemes that contributed greatly to the Republican National Committee. I don't make a value judgment of that, just it is the case. I was speaking earlier this week down in Florida to a group from the pet products industry, and they're very concerned about blanket tariffs, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And one of my things is that you have your legislative action committees, you have your folks that are your lobbyists, be working on the modifications and exclusions for your industry. That will be a part of the game that comes forward. So what has Mr. Trump promised or proposed in terms of tariffs going forward? Well, one is a 10% across the board. And then if a nation retaliates against that, then you would raise it up even higher. He's also proposed 20% across the board. He's recently proposed 25% tariffs on all goods in Canada and Mexico. In other words, undo the free trade agreement that he actually negotiated in his first term. 10% for China on all goods, but you keep the ones, the current regime that run anywhere from 7.5% to 100% that we talked about, or also proposed 60% on all Chinese goods other than the ones that are currently under the books for 7.5% to 100%. So what happens when tariffs are imposed? So I've done something that probably I shouldn't do, but I put one of these figures that you all may have had to suffer through in microeconomics 101 or 102 or whatever the number was in your freshman econ class, that talks about demand elasticity. And as you move more toward that left side of that blue line, you get inelastic demand, meaning that it's a pretty set product. Water in the desert, right? You'll pay any price to get the water you need to stay alive, versus that right side talks about that a very small change of price would cause the demand to change substantially. So, think about discretionary spending, discretionary goods. We roughly now get about $83 billion in tariffs coming into this country, of which the vast majority of that is the Section 301 tariffs on Chinese goods. If we impose any of these tariff regimes, particularly the blanket ones, 10%, 20%, either way, the cost of international goods are going to rise. And what we know, despite everything that comes in political rhetoric, is that these prices will be paid by consumers. You are not going to have much incidence of the shippers, the producers of these goods, absorbing the whole thing. That seems to be much of the assumption that we have in the analysis being done by Mr. Trump's economist. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. Domestic prices could also rise, because if you are a domestic producer and you're competing with these international goods and their prices rate goes up 10% or 20% because of that new tariff, that actually gives you the wiggle room to increase your prices. That's typically what we've been seen before. So it's possible that for some producers in this country, profits would rise, and that would be a good thing. However, all of this is undoubtedly, no matter how you do it, is going to cause prices to increase. And those rising costs and those rising prices means that the Federal Reserve will either maintain or increase their interest rate. And so the net effect is going to be, considerably could be worse. And these things, of course, keep in mind that when you rise these, if you're talking about intermediate goods, it flows through the economy. In other words, it's not just hitting one industry because of the interaction terms, the value chains of these various industries. It will flow through. There will be some potential for good substitution. If it's not a blanket, then, for example, goods that have been produced in China, maybe maybe we move that and they get sourced from Thailand or Indonesia or Cambodia or any other place. Now, one of the things that will be interesting is whether or not some of that winds up being, passed through. In other words, it goes from China to Cambodia, and Cambodia, we're supposed to have systems that will detect that, but I'd expect there'd be some of that. And then, of course, if you get retaliation at all, it reduces demand for our export goods, which means that those companies in this country that export would see their profits drop. I mentioned that I was at a pet product convention this week speaking, and dog food, or actually pet dog and cat food combined, is a really interesting thing. We import about something in order of $1.9 billion worth of pet food from around the world and into the US each year. However, we export about $2.5 billion worth of pet food around the world. And our largest market is actually export market has been that growing middle income in China. They produce cheap dog food. We have households in this country that use cheap dog food. But the products that are made in this country are across the globe considered to be the absolute best in this pet food market. And so we have, as incomes rise and you have more middle income, they are treating their pets to better quality food, which is made in America. So it's an interesting thing. But if you have retaliation from the products, that would reduce that. So it's sometimes we're chasing markets, we're applying these things into markets where it's not demanded. That it does not mean that we shouldn't do trade policies where there is national security implications. So please don't confuse my statements to say that you don't have a case at all. So this is a complicated slide. I'm not going to go through every piece of it, but all these different sources, people that study this, the Tax Foundation, American Action Forum, UBS Bank, the Peterson Institute for International Trade or International Relations, Moody's, you can see these different sources of what they would expect these different levels of tariffs to do to GDP growth. And it's all generally negative, right? All of them, and just no matter what their scenario is. Now, the degree to which it's negative, don't say. But if we are looking at slower growth in this country coming up, as many of the prognosticators are doing now, we'll talk about our forecast in a little bit here in just a few minutes. But as we're looking through all of these situations, if we're talking about GDP growth at 2.3, 2.4%, 2.6%, some are saying even below 2% at this level, and you knock another 0.5% or 1% or 1.5%. I'm not so much into Moody's prediction of 3.6% decline, but either way you go, that's a lot less growth. That lowers demand for wages, but at the same time, it's artificially causing prices to rise. So what are the impacts on households? For many of you, if you think about this, well, different folks have looked at it different ways, but National Retail Federation with a 10 to 20% universal, or a 6, and then the 60 to 100%, talking about household spending power across the U.S. reducing by $46 to $78 billion annually. That is a lot of restaurants, retail, and other sales that simply are not happening. American Action Forum is talking about, on a household basis, cost increase $2,600 to $4,300 a year. Others have done this, and you see the story, how it comes about. Tax Foundation, $6,000 a year. The Center for American Progress. The one that is a little bit different The Coalition for a Prosperous America, you may have seen them cited some in the media, and for a 10% universal, they actually predict that there will be growing output and incomes in the US. However, academic, professional, bank economists have been trashing that number pretty regularly, just saying that what apparently they did was they took existing models, changed the coefficients in the model, and got the answer that they wanted. I will say that one of the things that becomes important to understand is that there are economists out there that do support this position. And one of those economists, I believe his name is Marin, is going to be the head of Mr. Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. It'll be the title of the position as president of the Council of Economic Advisors. He produced a paper not too long ago, and in that paper, he basically said that optimal tariffs for the U.S. would range, based on others' work, would range between 20 and 50% on all imported goods. He notes, though, that there is a huge caveat. The caveat is that assumes no retaliation, that all of the other nations in the world basically say, yes, sir, may I have another? You're going to put those kind of restrictions on our products and all this, but we're going to do nothing back to you. And indeed, this person has actually said that, at least in his view, what we should do is impose these tariffs, and particularly for people that we have strategic military alliances with, that we say that, well, if we have a mutual aid compact with you about military defense, if you don't agree to just, suck it up and take these new tariffs, if you try to retaliate, then we will not honor any of those agreements for military aid and military support, mutual aid. And of course, that strikes me as very transactional and probably not good in the long run. But I give you this information just because this is somebody who has said this. He notes very upfront about his caveat that it's actually a very narrow window for that benefit to occur. But this is somebody that the president and his key advisors are listening to. So if we sum this up for the U.S. economic outlook, inflation proven to be stubborn, rising. The president announced, what was it, last week, that it came up with, that he's going to create which we assume will come out of the Treasury Department, a new department of external revenue, that will be charged with collecting all his tariffs. So we have to assume at this point that he's able to do this. Keep in mind that it's actually within federal law and the Constitution that it's the role of Congress to do trades, but starting in the 1960s, increasingly Congress just abdicated that responsibility to the president and just let the president do it based on rules and tariffs. So we'll see what happens. The wages, we talked about this with, baked into all these labor agreements that we've seen coming out. What you will see is that if the tax cuts get extended that he's talking about, you might have a boost in spending. I am very much concerned overall nationally about the rising levels of credit card debt and the interest rates, the absolute huge interest rate charges that young people are basically just continuing to spend on their credit cards. We certainly will see price impacts because of materials from disaster recovery, whether you talk about the stuff that's still being rebuilt in the Carolinas for the flood, or obviously these horrible fires that have hit Los Angeles. They're talking now about the most costly natural disaster in the country's history. They're in the Los Angeles fires. And then, of course, there is little to suspect from the previous Trump administration on through that there will be public spending that's going to be cut nearly as much as what Mr. thse and Mr. Musk have been talking about. Of course, we know that, that's unrealistic and they just threw out a number, for political purposes. But even so, I think they are going to find the reality of cutting the budget to be much more difficult than what I think they're giving it credit for. Interest rates, I think the interest rate reductions are dead for the moment. I would be very surprised if we saw any action through March, but there will be that political pressure that will ramp up probably more than we've ever seen before. Banking lending, I would expect us to have lower oversights, lower regulations, which is good. Um, I think we'll get to the point where, particularly as we are trying to refinance some commercial office buildings and things like that, that maybe we will find that the regulators will pare back their rules and their oversight a little bit, that make some that will allow some of these at the margins that otherwise would be blocked may get to go through and get and have the lending go through and renewed. However, there's many of these spaces are just now bad deals, and that removal of a regulation is not going to make a good deal or make a bad deal a good deal, as those many of you in this audience know. So others, I mean, our stock market continues to rise. I mean, we'll get some speculation out of meme stocks and, of course, Bitcoin and all that kind of stuff. And some of that will be because of the anticipated benefits to businesses from lower levels of regulation. I am a big proponent of lowering regulation when you can. I am a little concerned about the interest rates and how that might impact M&A activity going forward. If because you get some of that has to be done under some debt financing, so there's some issues there, and then how you calculate the value of deals, the interest rates matter on that. I do think that there's going to be heightened business uncertainty. Now, I've seen recent surveys, and this applies regionally and nationally, that businesses are very optimistic going in because of the likelihood that the overall administration is going to be more business friendly. But if we have this flopping back and forth between positions like what we saw with the tariffs in 2018, 2019, that increases uncertainty, not lowers it. So I'm not sure how that's going to balance out. I think there's going to be, on the one hand, so the two-handed economist coming out here, one hand says that you're going to have a lighter touch by federal regulators. It's going to promote business, help profitability. And the other is, but we're going to have a lot more volatility in some key parts like trade policy, what happens with federal spending and some things like that. There are a whole lot of businesses across this country that rely on federal spending. So if you start talking about removing non-discretionary spend, or rather removing the discretionary spending out of the budget, so you're not talking about Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, those kind of things, which Mr. Trump says he's not going to touch, then you're talking about chopping off some other procurement stuff. Now, on the other hand, of course, we also say we're going to increase defense spending. So I'm not sure how that comes out. The job market, I'm concerned about immigration, and we'll see how that plays out. What I have been told is that some of the states, like you think about like the governor of Texas, believes that what's going to really happen with immigration is that we will have a accelerated and much more concentrated effort on deportations of people who are in custody, either sitting in jail cells or in ICE custody, that getting beyond that would be too disruptive. And part of that reason, and that statement was made to some developers in Texas, actually the Construction Association in Texas. I love this number. The people that hang wallboard in Texas, 70% of them are undocumented aliens. So if you start a mass deportation program that just goes out into neighborhoods and trying to round up people who are not here legally, you're going to shut down a lot of business. You're going to have construction coming to a grinding halt. You're going to see problems in food processing. Obviously, the farm sector gets hit by that. So we are going to be somewhat constrained. And one of the things that I would tell you is that even if it's just rhetoric for the rest of it, it will slow immigration. But folks, at this point, we need that immigrant labor force. We need those folks to be in the country. I don't have any clue how to think of what's going to happen in Ukraine, the Middle East. Hopefully, this ceasefire sticks in the Middle East, but we could see that. So overall, because of these great uncertainties of these things, I'm having to kind of go the range of thinking that we'll see GDP in that 1.8 to 2.1%. So a little bit slower growth. We might, if they impose a 20% across the board tariff, I could see us having a quarter negative growth. I don't think we'll tip into recession or anything like that, but I could see us having some slower growth. Or you also have that effect unless Keynes and all of those folks were completely wrong. If you start in the next year or so starting to cut back a lot of federal expenditures, that is going to take money out of the economy. And I do not see business growth immediately making up that difference, which just means GDP is slower. And of course, a lot of that stuff may not actually get enacted until 2026. But I'd say for all of this year, we can expect that there is underlying strength of the economy, but it's just not going to grow as rapidly until we kind of get a sense of exactly what the new administration policies are going to be. So now let's switch gears and talk about what's going on in the regional economy. And again, I decided just to be a little cheeky and to have a little bit of fun with it, if you want to call it fun. But and we'll talk about some specifics here in just a moment. But what I could tell you is we are seeing the biggest economic threat to this region if we take at face value everything that was said during the presidential campaign about what's going to happen with federal spending, the federal workforce in this region. We haven't seen that since the War of 1812. And the question is, are we ready? You may remember my predecessor, Steve Fuller, who spent the better part of 50 years preaching to the choir here, or preaching to folks about the need to diversify the structure of our economy more away from the federal sector. I've talked about it for years. We've talked about it in this forum for several years now. And the question becomes, are we ready to move on from having upwards of 40% of our economy being dominated by federal employment and procurement spending? So what has Trump and the Department of Government Efficiency, which isn't a real department, but it's what they're calling it, what have they promised? Well, a full return to office for federal workers. Mayor Bowser is certainly cheering that, and certainly there would be some advantage to that. But I would tell you that if you read the second paragraphs of many of these stories, they don't really expect the workers to come back. They're expecting workers to quit. The number I have heard is about 30% of the federal workforce is eligible to retire today. So if they have, during the course of what's been happening, decided to buy a home in Western Loudoun County or Stafford or Frederick, Maryland, or someplace a little bit out to where they could afford something more than a 2-bedroom condo, what is the chances of them wanting to come back to a job that requires them to be on I-95 or I-66 or 270 in the American Legion Bridge 5 days a week? Probably not going to happen. Of course, and some of this is being complicated because the work you might have saw where the Health and Human Services, I believe it was, that actually just wrote into the contract where they can telework for several more years now. So it'll be interesting. We also have the whole narrative about the Schedule F workers. In other words, more political appointees, get rid of career bureaucrats and actually go back to what would become almost the patronage system that we got rid of in the late 19th century. But that's something they say they want to do. Relocate federal agencies and departments. Senator Joni Ernst, I understand, has just filed a bill. I have not seen it yet, that says that calls for the relocation of 30% of the workers at all federal agencies. That I got to see the detail on that. I don't know. But what I can tell you from the first Trump administration, and you may well remember, and we've talked about it before, is that under just an executive order, the Bureau of Land Management was relocated to Colorado. 2 of the departments of the Department of Agriculture were moved to Missouri. Those 2 that went to Missouri have not ever return. The Biden administration brought back the Bureau of Land Management, but I think that that's going to be the low hanging fruit for Mr. Trump to fulfill some of his campaign promises that he made across this country, that we are going to relocate. So you leave senior staff and the secretaries in places, but you could have the Department of Energy based in Houston. You could have the Department of Agriculture based in Omaha. You could do something like that. And of course, we've talked about slashing government spending and the deportations. We talked about that. So how all that, is kind of an overlay of all of the challenges that we had already been having. You may recall that we've been talking about that the DC region has not grown as well as the nation for several years now, for a few decades now. And you can look up there and just kind of see that rate of growth. We did very good during the Great Recession compared, because we had the underpinning of the federal government to grow. And these numbers that you see at the top for the 5 years in there, that's the compound average growth rate for the period of time that's between the vertical black lines there. And you can see we almost caught up in that period of time that ended at the beginning of the Great Recession, if you will, because again, federal government had a lot of stuff going on. And so we didn't quite see the dip down other parts of the country did. And then since then, it's a matter of rounding. So technically we're still below the US a little bit, but we're closer. But here's the key thing. And this number goes up through 2023, our most recent data, but in 2022, and I think I mentioned this last year, that about half of our gross regional product growth in this region could be attributed to the data centers that were added in Loudoun County alone. That was half of our gross regional product growth. I have not finished tracking through the numbers for 2023 yet, but I got to believe that number is pretty similar. We did not see a massive uptick in other employment in 2023 that would say that that's why we had it. We saw the only sector of our economy that is outperforming the US overall is the data center industry. And of course, naturally, in the last year or so, that is the industry that is seeing rising levels of public opposition. The NIMBYs, the bananas, all of them do not want data centers anywhere near them. They come out with the hyperbole in their public meetings about that the noise keeping their kids up at night and all these. And certainly there are bad design data centers out there, particularly in the early years, 10, 12 years ago when we first started seeing them. But you also have the sheer point of what they contribute to the region, the tax base. If you are a resident of Loudoun County, you are paying, I think the number is something like $5,600 a year less in taxes compared to if your house was in Fairfax County, the same value home. The tax rates in Prince William and Loudoun, where we have the data centers have really expanded, have been dropping. And the property tax rates have dropped substantially. Elsewhere in the region in Northern Virginia, they've been increasing. The property tax base, the taxable property tax base adjusted for inflation in Fairfax County over the last, say, 12 years has risen about 16%. In Arlington and Alexandria, it's basically flat. No growth at all on an inflation adjusted basis. Whereas in Loudoun and Prince William County, both of them, their taxable commercial property tax base has gone up more than 200%, something in the order of 232%, 216%, if I'm remembering the number correctly. So my point here is that while this headline number is looking like we're catching up, it's on a very narrow frame. And we've seen now the legislation that's been introduced into the state legislature, the bill that's been introduced that would clarify to make it to where localities have more ability to restrict growth on data centers. And I appreciate that there are a lot of questions, a lot of things that need to be addressed from energy and all that. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it's just our best growing sector of the economy is the one that we seem to be really working against at this level. And there is not anything else emerging that's going to be nearly that beneficial. Annual job change. So we are growing since the recession. We've seen, we had year over year growth in November. The last data that we have is about 36, almost 37,000. But you'll notice that that rate of growth we've had a little uptick in the last couple of months, but we saw, a real slowing in overall job growth in this region. And again, if you think about, so drawing a line, if I were to draw a line atop all of those seasonal bumps that you see in the green data, that's the total. So you get the seasonal variation going on there. But if you kind of take a line across that top and draw it out, and then you look at post-pandemic, we are still below that what that trend line would have been if the pandemic hadn't happened, though we are up above the absolute level in the pandemic. But that's actually even been different within the region. The District of Columbia is still, if you just look here and kind of eyeball it, you can see the District of Columbia is still something of about 15, 16,000 fewer jobs today than what they had in 2020 before the pandemic started, February 2020. So this is really problematic. Now you've seen a little bit of growth here, but the growth has slowed. And indeed, the other one that's not looking very good is suburban Maryland. Suburban Maryland's growth has been anemic. And in fact, you can see several months at the beginning of the year where they had year over year by month job losses. Maryland is having a tough time competing for jobs. And of course, part of it has to do with Maryland tax structure. And yet they also are facing substantial deficits, and the governor is talking about having to raise taxes on wealthy individuals. He says he's going to do some things to make taxes better for businesses, but we'll see what actually gets passed through the state legislature on that. Northern Virginia, on the other hand, has been on a pace that's actually been pretty good. But again, look at that difference of just a couple of years ago when we were covering. We are still even below now what we were seeing over our kind of longer run average in terms of job growth. So we've slowed a good bit, and we'll talk more about that now. But the trend line has actually been fairly positive. I'd say that if you just were to extend that line of growth before the pandemic and look, we haven't quite got back to where we've recaptured the growth potential of it, but we are moving in the right direction in Northern Virginia comparatively. But part of that has to do with labor force and labor markets. The regional labor force, and I may have mentioned this number last year, I can't remember when we actually put out this data, but when we were looking at the regional labor market, Northern Virginia has gone in the last couple of 3 years, gone from being 48% of the workforce to 50% of the workforce. Now, a lot of you might say, oh, well, that's only 2%, but in labor market terms, 2% is a lot. So very complicated slide here. We're looking at for the MSA year over year job counts by sector. So like that top line there, our biggest sector of the private sector, well, our business sector of the economy employment wise is professional and business services. This is where all the contractors are, but it's a lot more than that. It gets into even building services and things like that. But we've seen about 11,000 year over year job growth. We're 38,000 above the level that we were at pre-pandemic. That's what that number in the red box would tell you. Health, education, and health services, mind you, that's private education. That's not public. So it doesn't include K through 12 school systems, at least public school systems. It does not include George Mason University, but would include, say, Marymount or one of the other private universities. But again, up over the last year. Health services has been recovering. Keep in mind that during health services, we also have that thing that health services took a real dip during the pandemic because of, elective procedures not being allowed. But we're seeing that growth there in the health services. Having said that, one of the key things that has always been, to me, a missed opportunity is that if you compare our health services employment to, say, the rest of the nation, the number of people we have doing medical services here is just what you would expect based on the size of our population. And I keep wanting us to look for ways of taking the bench science that gets done out of these companies in suburban Maryland and the research out of Johns Hopkins and turn that more into cutting edge clinical practice. Because I'd love for us to have the kind of competitive numbers that you see out of places like Houston with MD Anderson, or perhaps the Mayo Institute, who actually are exporting their services to the world. People come to be treated for special things. I'd love to see us have that kind of effect. Federal government is up about 600 year over year and up a little bit over that. That actually is a recovery because we had been down a good bit. Here's one of the things I got called last week by a reporter from the New York Times looking at the federal data at the national level and said there's been 150,000 federal jobs added to in the nation in the last year. So DC must be just knocking it out of the ballpark. You guys must be doing great. And it's kind of like, well, no, that's not the story. The federal sector has actually been for a while, even before we had Trump and Doge and all this other stuff, that we've been diversifying away from this area. If you had 150,000 job growth change year over year for the federal sector, but we only saw 600 of those net job gains in this region. And the District of Columbia actually is down 300. That'll come up in a chart here in just a moment. Leisure and hospitality, we've actually had some recent declines in that. And some of that comes into, restaurants and stuff like that are still being challenged. And we're still below pandemic levels by almost 12,000 jobs. Retail trade has bounced back. We're actually above that now. We get down in here. Financial services is declining. A lot of that has to do with closures of branch banks and consolidations and things like that. But it also has a whole big piece of that deals with the mortgage market, where we're not obviously refinancing loans to much lower interest rates like we were during the immediacy after the pandemic. Information sector is a challenging one. We're up a little bit, down over the year, but up a little bit overall. I noticed that manufacturing, our smallest sector, we've actually had some good news in manufacturing. So I've been trying to say this for years. I haven't spent too much time on our sessions together doing this, but I keep trying to tell folks that high-end manufacturing can't afford to be here. Maybe not in Arlington or Alexandria or Montgomery County, but high-end manufacturing, we look at what's going on with Micron and some of the other businesses that are out there. We should not be so dismissive of manufacturing sectors, particularly in the age of additive manufacturing, 3D printed technologies, all these kind of things, because you can do some of this, but it also may require some investments and changes in things like the airport that we have, Dulles Airport particularly. Professional business services, this is what I was talking about, is, last couple of months have actually looked a lot better, but most of this year has been pretty bleak for growth in this sector across the country and across the region. This is concerning because this is where we're seeing. What I'm waiting to see is what happens in the next revisions, because these are estimates from the BLS. It's not an absolute number. It's based on surveys. And from time to time, they have to make some adjustments in their modeling assumptions. So we're going to wait and see as if this is an artifact or if we've had some reemerging strength. I think some of it actually may be some return to office. I think there's a component of that in here. But again, how much is that going to happen and how deep as it gets? That's a kind of an open question. Federal procurement spending continues to rise. The 2024 number, sorry, we got a little bit of that cut off. It will continue to add because there's a running total in any of the most recent years because you keep getting new data in, as contracts get billed out and stuff like that. So that number will continue and it will tick up. 2024 will tick up a little bit more. 2023 is pretty well set. But the thing that I want you to note is, if you think back, and I'll just go back for a moment, if you take that black line here at the top, and you'll see how we've kind of been going up and down. There's some seasonal variation, but been up and down in that professional sector. But overall, it's been relatively flat in terms of total. Yet our procurement spending has every indication continuing to go up. And indeed, the slope of, if I take those and I kind of annualize the data and I compare the slope of the line, we have seen for the first time a bit of separation emerging between professional business services employment and the growth in procurement spending, such that if you will, it's spreading out. So federal procurement spending continues to rise, and the employment level is kind of not flattening out, but not rising as fast. That is a real challenge for us. Federal government, I talked about this before, and you can see this more longer range. And there is, I cannot see a scenario, because keep in mind, those federal workers that are even telecommuting, there's a lot of them are, it's still showing up here. And in fact, it's unclear to me how well they measure, because the federal agencies had been telling us over the last couple of years that because they could not find particularly technology workers who were willing to come to this region and our cost of housing, cost of living for a federal wage, that they had hired those folks remotely, but those jobs still count for this region. So, some of these people are not actually here. That's not a huge number, by the way, folks, but it is built in there. But one of the things that I would tell you is that there is no scenario in my outlook that says federal employment is going to bounce back up to, say, 2010, 2011. I think the federal sector for employment, we hope, I think our best outcome at this point is flat. And most of the scenarios that we can come up, say, is that Trump's going to do something to the location of federal workers just to fulfill campaign promises. Here's our key challenge that we have here, is just that we still have a lack of workers. We're going to talk more about it later, but you can see that even the district is only about 5% unemployment now. Northern Virginia is up a little bit over what it was, but it's still below 3%. Suburban Maryland has really taken a little bit of an uptick. I'm watching that one, and you can almost see it there if you look carefully, that kind of brownish line that's or whatever we want to call that color. We'll call it semi-golden for suburban Maryland. It really took a big jump up, and so I'm wondering if there's not just a little bit of a data anomaly going on with that one. I do not expect the unemployment rate to have actually ticked up that much, so we'll see what comes with that when we get revisions, because these numbers are always revised. So you get the new number and they go back and revise the previous 2 to 3 months before that. So I expect that number to come down. I would think that suburban Maryland is closer. Its running average had been right about the MSA level, just below the MSA level. So I'd expect them to be more in about the 3.2% range. This is a measure from a publication called Area Development. It is an economic development publication focused on site location, people, and operators. There's a little bit of an overemphasis in their membership that are from manufacturing, which of course is our smallest sector. But I bring this up, and actually the data that's done for area development is the analysis is actually performed by Chimura Economics, which is a Richmond-based firm. Chris Chimura and I serve on some panels together, and a really sharp person. But I put this up there just to kind of point to how other people perceive us. Now, compared to the 2023 rankings, when we were like number 320, that looks better, but in that they've also have changed the number of metro areas. They've split some up. So like, for example, versus last year, the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area was considered one region. In this year, or in the 2024 rankings, which just were published this month, they've actually separated the Dallas side and the Fort Worth side of the economy. So there's been some splits like that, and that would change the dynamics. With any of these numbers, I think you can kind of take them a little, I won't say a grain of salt. You can look at them and see there's much about how they're doing. I mean, to tell me that Miami, Florida is the best of the large performing areas, that's one thing. If you tell me Brownsville, Texas, which is down on the Mexican border, down near the Gulf, is the best place to do business in the country, I will say that you're really taking some interesting mental support drugs, I guess, for lack of a better term. Give you a sense, Brownsville, that's close to where SpaceX is doing some of its launches. So I have a feeling that some of this growth is just in percentage terms based on what's been happening with SpaceX. But you look at some of these other, the main point that we have here is that we are way down. When people think about site locations, where do I want to locate my business, unless your prime customer is the federal government, we are not on folks' short list. And that is a challenge for us in attracting the kind of businesses that are independent of the federal workforce. And again, we see the numbers, the out migration of workers. I would tell you, all of our evidence suggests that this is young families that they've done all they can do in a 2-bedroom apartment or condo, and they're ready for a home. And we simply, we're too expensive. Daycare is too expensive. Now it looks better than it did, right there, right after the pandemic, but it's still 41,000 more people in that period from July 1st of 2022 to June 30th of 2023 moved out. The other in this chart that I want to point out to you is that mid-green color, not the darkest green and not the lightest green, that's the domestic, but the international migration, which is, as you start on the left over there, is at 31,000 is the international net number. And you can look at what that number did. And during the first Trump administration, after he came in, we saw that decline. Obviously, during the pandemic, it dropped off, and since then has bounced back up. I'm going to tell you that under most every scenario that we do with Mr. Trump's policies, we can expect that number of international migrants to actually decline. The District of Columbia saw their first population growth since the pandemic in this last year, and it was for them tied specifically to improvements in international migration. Inventories 11% better than they were, but just look at that line and the number compared to even 2015. So 10 years ago, the number of homes that we have on the market any given month is, running around 17, 18,000, something like there. Or actually it's 12,000, 13,000, compared to what we used to have, which was closer to, 35,000. We just don't have homes for sale for people to buy into. And because of that, home sales have declined a good bit. You look at this movement, we're up a little bit year over year, 794 for the month, but the overall, it's we're looking and notice that it got really bad during the 2013 period when we had sequestration. We see some other periods that are down, but nonetheless, home sales are just, been constrained, and we simply are not building enough homes. You can see this trend line and look how far that very last number that we have down there. And we report these because of just how they do it. Here's the other thing about building permits. We have jurisdictions in this region that will brag about how many permits they've issued, but they've put so many regulations on those permits, rent controls, all these other things. And the actual net effect is nothing gets built. So I'm going to tell you that we need a different attitude about how we are doing land use management when it comes to the production of housing units. One of the things that I think is important to add into this is to talk about the prices. Here's the thing that does. So this is average home price across the region, and you can see we continue to rise. But focus for a moment. So that black line is the 12-month moving average. So that helps us kind of get rid of the spikes that we see from seasonality. But you can look at how much more volatile the pricing has become in the seasons since the pandemic. But if you look there between 2022 and 2023, so just right up above where that label for December 2024 is, if you go right up to right up above that toward that left, you notice that the price, the 12-month moving average price, kind of flattened out for a few months. That was the period of time when mortgage rates effectively doubled. But the notion here is that even with a doubling of the mortgage rates, going from the mid 3s to as high as 7%, it didn't really cause any home prices to fall. Households were just accepting much higher mortgages. You've heard me talk before about my friend Lisa Sturdivant, who's at Bright MLS, their chief economist, who had looked at, was looking like 22 to 23, August 22 to August 23. If you bought a house in Arlington in August of 22, if you had waited and bought that same house in August of 23, because of price increase and mortgage rate increase, your average mortgage payment would double from one year to the next. And you just think about what that means for affordability, what it means for other spending that you may do. If you have this 6% mortgage, you're probably not going out to eat as much. You're not buying as much at the retail shop. So it spills over throughout the economy. So what are some of the overall factors then, if we start summing this up as we're getting toward the end? Is that we certainly are going to see a back to the office push. Amazon has announced theirs. We will see how that works out. I think Amazon is also in one that, quite frankly, they claim they're not, but I just can't help believe they did so much over hiring during the pandemic period that they're still not trying to thin out their ranks a little bit. I will say, if you go down around there where the Amazon buildings are in Arlington, it's a dynamic, interesting thing. Restaurants are busy during the day and all that, but in the long run, the labor force is still tight. And we've started living lives differently now. We just don't go to offices 5 days a week. Jamie Dimon has talked about this a lot for his bank, but of course, before the pandemic, he convinced his board to not lease their space in downtown Manhattan, but to buy it. So he's sitting on a whole lot of dead assets if he doesn't have people back in the office. But again, I understand there are dynamics that say that, but to maintain corporate culture, to get that innovation, water cooler innovation, does it really require being in the office 5 days a week, given the way we live, given the way the young couples live now and maintain their what's going on with their families? I think it's really problematic, if you will, to think that we're going to go back to pre-pandemic era working. The relocation of federal agencies, we talked about that, but what I want you to keep in mind is that if you relocate that federal worker, you lose the induced spending of their household spending. So, so that could be another half job. It depends on, exactly how much they're making and all that. But on average, that could be about a half a job, 0.4, 0.5. But also, remember that if you relocate that worker, if that worker, say an IT worker in federal government, has a contractor, say from Leidos or one of these other companies that's providing support, that support job goes too. So we could see a loss of somewhere between 2 and 3 jobs for every one of the federal workers that are located. I mentioned the bill that Joni Ernst had done. If you just take the rough averages and you look at all of that, then we're talking about 30% would be over 100, just off the top of my head, would be something like about 120,000 federal workers that we would lose in this region. And if you have that multiplier effect on top of it, because unfortunately, economic multipliers work both ways, either adding jobs or subtracting jobs. And so if you add that multiplier effect on it, we could be talking about a loss of 200 to 300,000 jobs in this region. And at our current pace of growth, that means that we have taken away almost 10 years of job growth. That's a really tough thing to come back from, because, how quickly does it happen? And how do you offset for that? The spending reductions is another thing. All of that depends on what it is that you're talking about. There's so much of the spending that we don't have control over. So I just don't know what we're going to get out of that and how meaningful it'll be. And because that also then gets that Congress is going to have to go along with losing spending that goes to their jurisdictions, their districts, if you will. And that's going to be, I think, a tougher thing than what some are thinking. We have already seen that divergence that I spoke to earlier in the federal jobs in the DC region, more federal jobs, especially cybersecurity jobs. We've been losing ground on that because cybersecurity is now so wrapped up in artificial intelligence. And while we have artificial intelligence here, and we have some of that going on, it's still more dominated in other parts of the country, particularly Boston, New York, and Northern California seem to be gaining more there. Procurement spending trends, obviously I talked about that divergence, if we will. But here's the other one. We've talked about this a little bit in previous years, but I'm very concerned about what the net effect will be under efficiency is artificial intelligence. If you think about it, what artificial intelligence can do. I would just today, I got a new update on Word, and now I can't get rid of these things that it's wanting me to use their artificial intelligence things, whether I want to or not. The thing that machine learning programs, language learning programs can do very well now is things that you could think of as being rule-based decision making. If this, if this, if this, then this. The language models we have now and have had for years now can do that very effectively. So I ask you, how many of the federal workers that we have in this region today basically go to work and make rule-based decision making? If this, if this, if this, if you've done this, if you qualify this, you do this, then you get this. I do not know that we will see a displacement of workers, but what I think we will see in the sense of going in and firing a federal worker and supplanting them with an AI. But remember that 30% of the workforce that's eligible to retire, I could see us dramatically under a natural, just technological change, efficiency in government change, not relocating the industries. I could see us reducing the federal workforce over a number of years by 40, 50,000 jobs. I don't know what that number is exactly, but it could be substantial. And again, these are high paying jobs with that multiplier, that induced multiplier effect that would go along with that. We are seeing some good news. This is not all doom and gloom. Sorry if it seems that way. We're seeing that the arena thing in Chinatown. Obviously, I think it's a great thing to see that maybe the Commanders go back to RFK Stadium here in the not too distant future. I would like for Maryland just to withdraw from that so the DC can negotiate a good deal. The revamping of federal office buildings. One of the things that I have heard is that Mayor Bowser and Senator Comer, who has the committee that has rules over the district, that they're actually working together on the divestiture of federal buildings. And if they do so in a way that makes it to where these buildings can be either redeveloped or renovated or whatever, and can be done so to where they're very price competitive, that's good for the district to re-earn. I don't know what that means for Tyson's and Montgomery County and other places like that. It may be a net wash, but it could make the district much more competitive if they do it right. We talked about the refinance of loans. I won't need to go into that anymore. Local government finances, though, we've got this WMATA fiscal cliff. We've got to come up with. They're still saying, I mean, remember the last time we were talking, they were $700 million. Now it's $500 million. So I don't know exactly how much WMATA has to have, what they could gain in terms of efficiencies, but we got to come up with more money. And then, of course, we're starting to see the office valuation declines. I mentioned before about what's happening in the the old traditional, say, Alexandria, Arlington, Montgomery County is not looking good in this space. The valuations are going back. The data centers, you will note that I'm pretty positive about data centers overall, but what I really get excited about data centers, it's not the data center itself, it's the industries that are going to drive high value added growth across this nation and indeed across the world over the next 20 years. Say, take us through the mid 21st century, and it's going to be artificial intelligence. It's going to be quantum computing applications, though I don't know what those applications, what the business case is yet. I don't know that anybody does, but all of these things all require massive amounts of data storage. And if we are a place where that data storage happens, then we can compete effectively for that business growth. So we either do things to promote, take advantage of our natural advantage that we already have in that sector, or do we seed that and let Dallas and Phoenix and other places across the country, including even Western Ohio, overtake us in that market and be the place where all that innovation and activity happens. So the outlook then, real estate, we're adapting to changes in utilization. I understand now that Arlington is going to, in their downtown area, experiment with form-based codes. I'm very supportive of that notion. I haven't studied the details of that yet, but we need to address housing affordability, and the best way to achieve that is to lower regulation, build more units, and let the market kind of catch up with it. In other words, do it from supply side. Get some of the bureaucrats out of the way that are blocking up what's going on. At least I've had increasingly local elected leaders blame their staffs for the slowness that it takes 2 years to get approval to do construction on housing or something like that. So get the bureau, tell them to change the way they do business. Transportation, we need a cost effective, and we need to finish what we started. In other words, we have got to get Maryland off their indecision and invest, come up with the way to invest to get the American Legion Bridge rebuilt and actually extend that all the way up through the 495 and 270 corridor. That should be their key transportation priority. And they've had the benefit that the federal government is going to rebuild the bridge, key bridge for them. We're going to have to see public-private partnerships to rebuild the built environment, because we can't do it on private sector, particularly if interest rates stay elevated. And I'd like us to extend that into childcare, where you have, the public-private partners. A business offers some way of doing childcare. In other words, some kind of an incentive or a subsidy. Parents are still having to kick in, but it is in public sector's interest to get those workers back to work, especially to bring up that labor force participation rate. Entrepreneurial support is key. We got to quit fighting amongst ourselves and thinking it's a win when a business moves from one local jurisdiction to another, even if it's across Potomac River. We need to embrace technology change and power and everything else. And one of the things that I'm going to say, though, is a lot of these actions that the Trump administration is proposing, can we use the court systems, like has happened in other things, including his criminal cases? Can you use the courts to at least buy ourselves some time to adjust, but going in, not saying that we're going to stop him from doing the things that might reduce the federal workforce or reduce federal spending, but just buy us some time so that we can change the way we do business and more effectively compete for private and commercial enterprise. And with that, gross regional product for their area, if we get all the, if Mr. Trump and his colleagues, if they get, the movement of goods and all that, we could see some negative growth in this region. I think it will take them more than a year to actually do things, but that just depending on the timing of when they start implementing. And so I see us maybe growing a little bit, though at a slower rate, and certainly slower than the nation. And I see job growth could be net negative if they actually implement some of these changes and move from the federal agencies out of the region. I just don't see where the commercial sector is poised to keep up. So generally, think pretty much flat growth for next year. A little bit. Some individual businesses, some of you will do very well. You look at your metrics and you can do well if your market particularly is more driven by what's happening outside the region. But I think it could turn out, if Mr. Trump is able to implement the policies that he says he's going to, we're in for a challenging year. So let's now, folks, let's move this back. I am going to stop. Let's see, do I stop sharing now?
Yes, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, that was a lot of information, a lot of great analysis. We appreciate that, Dr. Clower. We do have some questions, so not much ado, I'm going to dive right in here, if that's all right. Immigration. There was a slide that you had up there where you're talking about out migrations. One of the questions that came up was, how might that be impacted if we see the new administration cut or discourage local services, local social services, for foreign arrivals? Do you have any? What are your thoughts?
I think we would have to, Dean, I think we just have to say that would be a part of the overall of what we saw in the last Trump administration, where the sheer number of international migrants dropped down in the region. And one of the key things to remember is the international migrants coming to this region. This is not like we are Houston or Miami or places like that. Our average immigrant, international migrant into our region has an education level that is about equal to the U.S. overall, not necessarily equal to what we have in this region because we're the best educated workforce in the country and all that. But they are highly educated. They're here. They're here to work at the World Bank. They're here to do things and those kind. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have folks that are also supporting us by being immigrants who are mowing yards, cleaning buildings, working in the kitchens and restaurants and stuff like that. And the fact of the matter is we need those workers across the board. And if you just look at the sheer numbers, even without the effects of massive deportation programs, which I actually think are going to be very costly and hard to implement, but just that threat of that is going to make fewer people come, and that's going to make it harder for us. I mean, you look at 50% of our construction labor force in our region is internet or non-citizens, and it will impact those. So what does that do to the cost of building and the cost of services? Getting, you want to renovate your home because it's too expensive to get another one, find people that can actually do the renovation.
Given everything you just said, are there steps the businesses could take to sort of help mitigate some of these changing policies with regard to immigration? I know we've got the rhetoric that's out there, but when the rubber hits the road, hopefully there's somebody that can help pull some levers that may lessen the impact.
It's kind of one of those. It's very much, and I folks, I'm going to say something, and it's going to sound callous, and I don't mean it to be, but it's very much like what I heard out of these construction folks in Texas that were saying, well, if they're deporting immigrants who are already in custody, either in jail or in ICE custody, they're not on the work side anyhow. So, and I think maybe that could be the best is let him do that, because one of the other things is that politically, it may well be that you just do this mass effort for people who are already incarcerated, deport them, and then you just declare victory. I've done more than anybody has ever done in the history of the world about this issue, and you just declare victory and you move on, recognizing that anything else will be just too disruptive.
Interesting. You spoke several times about the return to office initiatives, and you talked about the impact. I want to talk just a little bit about the ancillary impacts, restaurants. What am I thinking of? Restaurants, transit, commercial landlords, those kinds of things. Can you go into a little detail on what you expect to see there?
Sure. So first of all, Dean, I think what we would have to admit is that if we have a substantial return to office, that overall it's a net zero sum game, because it's been interesting. Our fastest growing economies in percentage terms in this region have been places like Stafford, Prince William, Spotsylvania, if we stay on the Virginia side, and the same thing a little bit in Maryland, maybe not to the extent. So, these households that have moved out, because they don't have to fight 95 or 66 5 days a week, well, they bring their spending with them. Right. So, the restaurants and retail and all that are doing quite well in these areas. And if you bring people back in, it's just taking some of that money away from these and giving it back to the district, which in effect, it wasn't net actual growth, because it was us, the district was paying the price for that out migration of jobs, if you will, or the actual place where we did. So that's a net zero sum game at best. And in fact, even if you do this, there's going to be some that will not return back. The district has had other challenges going on. The crime numbers are getting a little bit better, but you had people who weren't going back to the office because they were more afraid to be walking from the metro station to their office than they used to be. And some of that was just the number of people. So it's a really complicated story, but at the end of the day, it's the same number of people. It's just where are they spending their daytime hours?
Move money from one pocket to another in the same pair of pants, so to speak.
Yeah.
Still on the same subject here. So you've got the reduction in federal jobs with the proposed relocations. We're going to reduce, the amount of immigrants. How do you see that affecting the housing situation? So, we've already got this issue where we've got pressure. You can't bring them in because they can't find places to live that they either like, want, or simply can afford. How do you see the interplay of those factors if you get Does the outflow somehow alleviate the pressure, I guess is my question.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one because we think about the different factors that play in that. So you have one is if you're talking about people who retire out of their jobs, do they stay in the area? And see, folks a lot of times will overestimate how many people are flying off to Florida as soon as they retire or going to the Outer Banks. I mean, and let's face it, those places are getting really tough because you can't get a homeowner's policy in Florida anymore, right? And so there's a little, it's more, and what we're seeing is that folks are staying around because if they've been here for a long time, they have kids or grandkids in the area, and so they're staying closer to family, right? So that doesn't drive it as much. The other one is that for some of these folks, I wonder if they wind up not getting stuck in their house, because if you have enough, if you lower overall demand enough, then prices are going to fall. And then you get people that are trapped in upside down mortgages. And we only have to go back to the financial crisis to remember when there were a lot of people who couldn't afford, who might have wanted to move that couldn't afford to because they didn't have $200,000 to bring to closing.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So it is an interesting dynamic that I could see. And the point is that what we, I would hate for us to meet our challenges of housing supply, not by building more houses, but by seeing enough jobs go away, because we'll all be poor for that. That would be presuming, it's not that we're going to become Detroit, but if you make federal government small enough, we could have some of those same challenges. Remember when Detroit was actually going through and paying neighborhoods to be raised? They were just eliminating, destroying 20, 30,000 housing units a year.
Is there anything that the businesses themselves can do to impact this? I mean, short of, we've all seen the programs where they offer moving bonuses and stuff like that, but you mentioned some of the policy challenges that are out there. How do the businesses, if at all,
I
how do
think
they affect any of that?
what we need is a collective effort by businesses to put the pressure on our elected leaders to do what is best for the region economically, and to, while listening to, but in some of it may require the political courage to maybe not get reelected and do what we need to do about building the houses, because the NIMBYs don't want anything built, or and the bananas, right? No building anywhere for any reason, right? Because they want to maintain their vistas the way it is. They bought a lot that happened to be next to industrial loans, and they didn't check on that to begin with. But God, do not put anything there, because I still want that pasture, next to my house, right? So there, I mean, and I'm not saying that there's not legitimate concerns about, growth and where growth happens, but we can plan through that. You don't do it by it taking, well, I'll give you, here's an example, and you think about how this gets rolled into our costs. A developer comes in and even under by rights development, meaning the zoning's already placed, it can take them 16, 18 months to get an approval for doing it. And you're going through multiple hearings, and you're going through this, and you're doing all these, and you're responding to all these things. And all of that, you got the cost of money while you're sitting there not doing anything, the cost, whatever you've invested in that land. And then you have all of the lawyers and everybody else that you're hiring. I remember one of the suburbs of Dallas 15, 18 years ago, new city manager came in and just said, our standard of practice is, I'm not telling you how you respond, but if somebody puts in a proposal, even, we have an answer for them in 2 months, 60 days. They have an answer. They may not like the answer, but it's that first answer. Not saying that, they can't, but what you do is you just shorten that timeline. And when interest rates, commercial rates on something like that, if they're paying 8 or 9% on that land, that matters a lot.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, the other fantasy that we have in this region is that when we do proffers and make the value, you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to restrict rent on it, you have to do, if you don't recognize that that just gets baked into the price of housing for everybody else, please go back and do the math. The developer still makes their profit. This is not that when we put those proffers in, it winds up in the price of the house or apartment.
Right. Okay, coming back, getting off the housing a little bit. So you talked a lot about reduced federal spending. Do you see areas where federal spending might increase? And if so, how do the businesses, government contractors position themselves to take advantage of it?
So this is where we'll see some. You can only expect that spending on IT is going to be, increased. I fully expect that we will continue to spend money in defense and homeland security, which regionally gives Northern Virginia a little bit of an advantage. I won't go so far as the old thing they talk about, Northern Virginia, where the death sciences are and life sciences in Maryland and all that kind of stuff. That's a little bit of a, maybe that's too extreme, but it's not completely untrue. The defense contractors will probably, do okay because there is, and for all this rhetoric, I mean, Mr. Musk and Viswami saying, $2 trillion is like, oh, so we're going to eliminate, most of the defense budget. Oh, well, no, we're not going to touch that. Oh, well, then we're going to talk about cutting edge. Oh, well, no, we're not going to touch that. So, this is part of the thing we get. So I don't see anything where we have Mr. Trump and Republican controlled Congress where, you're not going to continue to see. Now, what could happen, though, is you might see some relocation of that spending. The good news here is most of the contractors, whether it's Lockheed, Northrop, Boeing, any of these, they have a presence here, right? And they have the headquarters and they have all this. So we're taking a little off the top, even if the submarine is built in Connecticut or someplace else, we're taking a little off the top as part of overhead. And I think that will continue. That will help underpin some of that part of the commercial sector, but it's also going to be one that I don't expect to see a massive amount of growth, certainly not enough to offset if they do these other things.
Gotcha. We'll talk about tariffs just a little bit.
Yeah.
Are there any opportunities for some of the local businesses to step in and fill gaps created by the tariffs? You talked about, was it alternate sourcing and that kind of thing? Good substitution. Is there anything I'm speaking specifically of the DC metro area?
Well, given that manufacturing is by far our smallest sector,
Sure.
and the manufacturing we do have here is already fairly competitive, I don't see that netting us out much of anything. There might be some opportunities here or there. What I'm really concerned about, and look, this is that difference of, is it a universal tariff, or are we going to just target the people that have irritated, a leader? I want honk them off, whatever. I was trying to use a better, you can imagine the word I was thinking of, or the phrase, and it's just like, well, we'll just stick with honking them off, right? I mean, because let's face it, we must keep those evil Canadians from competing too much with us. On the other hand, remember what we did last time. We put the tariff on softwood lumber that caused housing material prices to jump dramatically, because he was mad at Justin Trudeau over something or another. So at least we don't have Mr. Trudeau. We don't know, who's going to be leading Canada. But the point is that if it's across the board, I don't see where we can do much. And other than that, it's a matter then your supply chains. You're trying to find, okay, well, if Mexico and Canada are getting hammered, can I alternate that source? But our supply chains are not, it's not like, it's like what we do in Amazon and all that. Here's the other little factor that comes into play that's really interesting, Dean. And this is, I'm getting a little bit in the academic weeds, but Amazon and Walmart have almost become monopsonist. In other words, they are so big that they almost have monopolistic pricing powers on their suppliers. And so one of the things is that it might be for some of these goods, we don't get the full impact of the price increases because Amazon basically beats up their vendors that are sitting someplace in, Indonesia or China or someplace else to actually assume part of it. But if it's a 20% increase, I can't see any, how could that business stay in place if they take 20% off the top?
Okay. All right, I think this is going to be our last question, and then time will be up. So I'll ask it, and then you'll finish it and close us out here. How does the size of a country's debt relative to its GDP affect the economy, both short and long term?
Interest rates.
More of a broad question, but
yeah, and it's one that's encouraged. Hey, look, I didn't even get into all of the challenge we have with a $2 trillion deficit. And one of the things that we saw in the last trumpet, the idea of either party being fiscally conservative is no more than pure lip smacking rhetoric at this point, because both of them just continue to spend. And whether you spend more money on defense or whether you spend more money on social programs, either way, we're spending more money than we're taking in. And Mr. Trump wants to extend out and make permanent his tax cuts, and that's going to increase. And the problem is that some point in time we will reach a tipping point where that will, other countries will not perceive us as being the best risk for their investment dollars, and it will then mean that interest rates go up dramatically if we're having to compete with other currencies for debt financing. We have got to do something about that, or what's going to happen. And I've seen some futurists that kind of say that, look, in reality, our generation, my generation, I'm the tail end of the baby boomers, and even Gen X will probably be fine. Our kids will probably be okay. Our grandkids are going to have a quality of life that is nowhere near what we have now, because they will be under such massive, tax debt and everything else going in. And so do we want to just continue to, kick the can down the road and have them do it? Or do we start holding our elected leaders responsible and understanding ourselves that we're going to have to deal with some all households need to have some short-term pain, actually at this point a little bit of pain for a long time, to get us back out of this debt hole.
Well, that's our last question. I want to thank everyone for participating. Thank you, Dr. Clower. That was a great presentation. Everyone enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.